This morning we did the first 5 years of life, and now inadvertently, just to get to puberty, I have to cover all of development, because a lot goes on between 5 and 9 or 10 or 11. But we'll see how far we can get with this entire treatise on development. And I don't want to go all the way into adolescence, but it's really hard to discuss puberty without talking about outcomes in later adolescence. And besides, puberty is messy and difficult, and it's hard to get those kids in treatment and stay in treatment. And it's much more fun to talk about later adolescents that are, so lively and creative and not so stirred up as pubertal children. But we're going to stick to puberty if I can. Now, puberty is the term most commonly meaning, when you get into the literature, and you'll all, if you're not already read all literature on the pubertal child, you'll discover a lot of confusion about terms. And I taught the course on adolescence for more than 10 years at the Michigan Psychoanalytic to the candidates. And the terminology in the literature is disparate, if not desperate. The problem with it is puberty, pubescence, pre-adolescence, and adolescence is thrown around since the 20s, and then the later heavy inclusion of ego psychology to the point where you're not sure what the speaker's talking about in the paper. In general, the classic literature, and yours truly, are going to use it in a very particular way. In general, I will use the term pre-puberty to connote the hormonal and physical changes that lead up to menarche in girls and ejaculation with live sperm in boys. And I'll tell you, those first ejaculations, the wet dreams and so on, are as important to boys as the menarche is to girls. Pre-adolescence, that's puberty. So puberty is that defining physical event. The pre-puberty, sometimes the word pubescent creeps in, and we'll discuss the terminology, is the hormonal and physical changes that lead up to it. Almost everybody realizes that little girls start with breast buds a couple of years before they have their periods. In fact, the pediatrician will tell you, when did you get breast buds? And I'll tell you exactly when she's going to have her period and so on. But that's puberty, that event. Pre-puberty is before, and the psychological and developmental parallels in the classic literature are really pre-adolescence to fit pre-puberty, and then adolescence thereafter. However, just because the kids have reached a physical climax, they're not done physically growing, and they're still, in my consideration, pubertal for another 1 or 2 years. If you try to discuss sex, politics, religion with a 13-year-old, forget it. It is not really until they're 15, 16, 16 before you can talk religion and politics. Not sex, but religion and politics anyway. They're not organized enough. So the event of puberty doesn't mean that psychological adolescence is ushered in, and you now have a real grown-up adolescent. What you have is a child that just had puberty and has 1 foot in childhood and 1 foot in freeing himself to become adult. With those caveats, puberty, pre-puberty runs, and the physical changes run from maybe 10 or 11 to 19 or 20, long after the pubertal event has occurred. So my discussion today should be titled Pre- and Early Adolescence, although we're going to have to know about the physical changes. Though the psychological events are brought about by the hormonal or bodily events of pre-puberty and puberty that thrust the latency child into an adult's body and the psychological tasks necessary to becoming this mature sexual adult. This period of change and growth is often neglected in treatment, the pubertal period of adults, because it seems almost as deeply repressed as the first 5 years of life. And our adult patients can sometimes recall the events of the pubertal years, but it is almost invariably without the affects. It's very hard to recall in the MS. And so it's very easy to overlook. It is hard to recall. There's a lovely poem, I didn't bring the poem about being 13, that it's in the Eisman book, which is the psychosocial aspects of adolescence. Perhaps we will see why as we study why it's so hard to recall the state of psychic structures through this period of development. For now, it is enough to say that the biologic changes have a profound influence on mental development. Hormonal and bodily changes put the child in touch with conflicts from earlier developmental levels and upset the balance of superego and ego, drives and defenses from latency, and color all psychic activities with new and revived drives. As Peter Bloss puts it succinctly, the intensification of sexual and aggressive drives of puberty revives early pre-Oedipal and Oedipal incestuous wishes and earlier conflicts. Of course, it's all the more threatening because the young adolescent's body is becoming adult and sexual. And at first, they certainly feel like a child in a foreign, grown-up, sexy body. We'll talk a little bit more about this issue of every stage of earlier impulses getting revived, because we're going to talk about regression. And, nothing ever goes away in the psyche. The oral conflicts are still there, the anal conflicts, the phallic conflicts, and they get built into character, and they get to be not much of a threat. But during puberty, all the impulses are at first revived. First, a word from our latency child, who has been this thrust upon him or her from inside and outside, too. Because the outside world expects him or her to be grown up as the body they now reside in. The elementary school child is said to be in the latency phase in psychoanalytic parlance. Freud viewed this phase as resulting from a combination of biological processes and social influences. I can put this on. Does this matter?
Don't worry about it.
Okay. Even he viewed latency as an educational ideal that was rarely met. Since we know elementary school children are very interested in grown-up sexuality, very interested, and they struggle with their masturbation and their impulses to masturbate, and occasionally, probably fairly ubiquitously, lapse into outright sexual experimentation, or at least mutual exploration. School children are, however, much freed up for learning. They're available for socialization and very curious about the world. They are preoccupied with the rules as they begin to develop the ego defenses against drive. They spend so much time on the rules that they can hardly get to the game at hand. They are obsessive with their collections, be they coins, action figures, Nancy Drew mysteries, etc. Indeed, the ego has grown so that much of their sexual drive energy can be sublimated. It isn't latent, it's sublimated, and the ego is much stronger now than the drive. And that is the secret to latency. But we still use the term because the literature is rife with it. The ego has grown to master the sexual and aggressive drives. When I teach medical students, I use the paradigm, the old, you've probably seen this one, kind of. The baby is born in the nursery with an ego that's only here. He's all drive. He's just all drive in the nursery. Got a few nuclei, can withdraw from light and pain and so on. He can scream when he's hungry. But gradually in the first 5 years of life, the ego grows and grows and grows. and masters the drive energy. So here we have a kid going into latency, and the ego is now much bigger than his drive. So what I'm talking about here is that the drive, again, under the central pressure from the pituitary and the hormonal results and the need to grow enormously and sexualize the body to become adult, the drive now overcomes the ego. But the important thing to remember is this is not the ego of the 5-year-old. This is now a bright, very savvy ego that the child faces puberty with, we hope. Because as I'll mention later, in case I mention it twice a month, the child learns to learn in latency. If a child doesn't learn to learn and love it in latency, boy, with my adolescent patients, it's very hard to help them. So latency is a topic in itself that we're not going to go very far into. It's the prelude to puberty. It's a time of learning and reaching out and beginning to idealize other grown-ups, to settle your family romance, to enjoy it, to become children of the world that come home before the streetlights come on. So they're still family children, and they can make a great use of parental egos. Indeed, the ego's grown so that much of their sexual drive energy can be sublimated, and that is the secret. We doubt this sexual energy ever went away. The latency ego has grown to erect better defenses and can sublimate. A 9 or 10-year-old boy is a delight to have around. He will not be in a year or two. He may sit on the porch all afternoon playing chess with a peer, or kick soccer balls with a gang of friends till dark. Then what happens? The soma and psyche are relatively overwhelmed by hormonal and centrally produced drive, which initiates quite startling changes in body and mind. The project, we had a project years back. Dr. Nauer at the time funded it. I don't know if you knew what we were doing back there with we had the first videotaper, and we recruited a bunch of faculty's pubertal children to talk to us about growing up. Now there's a trip to get children to talk about growing up. And we had one 11-year-old girl who volunteered to talk about growing up. But by the time we got her into the room with the cameraman, who was very nice, and they were trying to be really casual with the camera and so on, she was reduced to complete shyness, covering herself up, and her new breast buds, and giggles. She was just overwhelmed with giggles. Pretty typically pubertal child. And when asked what her favorite book was in the course of trying to get her comfortable, she thought for a long time, and she said, "I think Winnie the Pooh." This is 11. This is a perfect 11-year-old. 1 foot in and 1 foot out of childhood. She went on to describe her walls as covered with rock stars. Good, distant possibilities of sexuality. Really distant. The physical changes paralleling the confusion should be well known, but I'm going to review them for all of our audiences. They are relative and include a wide range of normal, though very early puberty for girls and very late puberty for boys produces different problems. And if you remember to ask me about it, I'll discuss it more later, but I don't know how long my voice will hold out and how I've got a lot of notes. From Stone and Church's book, Childhood and Adolescence, he details the growth of the pubertal physical growth very well. The child's growth first begins to show an upturn from a plateau during early latency, very slow upturn, about 4 years prior to puberty, or maybe a little less, maybe between 7 or 8 in girls and 9 or 10 or so in boys. So there's just a little upturn in this plateau, but it is very slight compared to the 2 years before the actual pubertal event, when children really shoot up. Growth is most rapid just about a year before puberty, and from there growth levels off until age 17 or so in girls, and up to 19 years or so in boys. I must add, though, in later adolescence, my shortish 16-year-old boy patients are hoping, that they're going to be 6'4" by the time they're 19. No, they might gain a half an inch from 16, a half an inch to an inch from 16 to 19 if they've had a sort of a normal pubertal period. One of our interviewees in this project I've described was willing to discuss growing up. He was 14 at the time. One of our interviewees, I'm going to talk about the girl first, was willing to discuss growing up, and she was 14 at the time. She was fully developed, beautiful figure, 5'8", tall and articulate, and she described her growth spurt a long time ago. I think it had been 2 years. It's quite startling, and it made the verbal slip. I was growing a foot a month. She laughed and corrected it to an inch a month, then described how mortifying shoe shopping was, that she now had size 10 feet, and at the time she'd only been 12 and hadn't grown into her feet. During this whole span of pre-puberty to 17 or 18, height increases about a quarter from latency, and weight doubles. Girls start first, so they're larger than boys during the critical, mortifying time for everybody between 11 and 14 years. During pubescence, all proportions, including the face, change. Boys' shoulders broaden, girls' hips broaden, layers of subcute fat form curves and soften the girls' contours. The boys don't carry as much subcute fat. They look leaner and more angular. And conspicuously, pubic and axillary hair develop, pubic hair first. Indeed, pubescence refers to the development of pubic hair, which is part of the pre-pubertal development. So that's pubescence. In boys, a darkest shadow of facial hair appears on the upper lip. The chest hair that boys long for doesn't occur till late adolescence, so they get to wring their hands over that for quite a few years. Orchestrated by this pituitary central gland and the subsequent hormones, skin pores become larger and oily secretions reunite the child with acne. And blackheads, sweat that smells develops. And occurs due to glandular changes that have to occur in order to grow up. Puberty is the climax of sexual development, although the menarche doesn't really mark fertility for probably at least a year. They can't count on it, but probably not. Breast buds usually appear just about exactly 2 years before menarche. In boys, the testes grow larger and finally pendulous, so that they're away from the body heat as live sperm develop, and the penis grows. The child has never, boys masturbate, it feels wonderful, but they've never experienced the sexual urgency that begins to evolve and really becomes very puzzling for the boy. A hard-on the bus or in chemistry class is very unwelcome by the boy. Doesn't seem to have any control of it. Voices change and become unreliable, particularly boys. It's famous. One foot or arm may be longer than the other for quite a while. Anna Freud, in her paper, Adolescence as a Developmental Disturbance, it's volume 7, feels that the psychological reactions to these internal and therefore external physical events represents an area somewhere between mental health and mental illness. The early theorists struggled with, what's the outcome of this? Is this child going crazy? It was considered a severe developmental interference, this pubertal phase. After all, a developmental interference in mental life is something that upsets the previous balance and requires new adaptations. This is exactly what puberty is. It is she was first to point out the initial increase in drive is quantitative. So the drive, which has to occur physiologically, is quantitative, bringing back all facets of infantile sexuality. As I've said, as hard as it is to believe, nothing's forgotten. The impulses, which will eventually organize around aspects of foreplay, seeing, touching, messing, so on, are all there, and they get revived at puberty. So what you see, and what Anna Freud saw, with obviously clearly mild alarm between the lines, was this quantitative rush of drive from infantile sexuality. And that is the end of latency. The child is more difficult to reach and teach and control. I've actually treated several middle school, junior high teachers over the years. They're very particular people to love these children. There's really little new in this indiscriminate drive activity, but it is startling to everyone to see the whole range of pregenital impulses emerging anew in previously well-defended latency children. All but particularly the boys, are greedier, more unruly, rude like they were not before, bigger show-offs, very phallic behavior, and interested in bathroom humor, whoopee cushions, farting sounds, and so on, and are trying to ward off oral, anal, phallic impulses that assault the latency ego and its nice control over drive that was so wonderful. Girls tend to work very hard at repressing all of this pregenital sexuality and avoid pregenital expressions, but the giggling, overwhelmed 11-year-old from my project is the norm. If you've ever sat with two nieces who were pubertal at once and made a long car trip with them, not good. They just giggle all the way. The girl was much more likely to launch into, with renewed vigor, into friendships and breezy control of academics and tomboyish effort at sports. For a girl, a best friend is a very special place, and a best girlfriend. She and her best friend seem to live and breathe together. Mm-hmm. It's a question I always ask in the developmental history and grown-ups is, what was your best friend like when you were 13? The rare girl that didn't have a best friend. They change. They're very fickle. I mean, they're coming to narcissistic attachments, but by God, they've got a best friend. In the project, we had a pair of them, and they only wanted to come in together. They were both about 13 and a half, so we had them in together. They were so in tune with each other that they were finishing each other's sentences. I have a video of all this. I couldn't bring it because these people are in their 40s now. They wouldn't want. Such best friends, the developmental norm, help the girl give up her preoedipal longings for the caretaking mother, one of her biggest tasks in adolescence. Not that it is always the same best friend, as I said, they're very fickle. Boys at this stage tend to travel in pairs and rather dread the Amazon-like girls while they struggle with their own preoedipal longings toward mother, as well as their fear of re-emerging incestuous edible fantasies. It's particularly threatening because the girl's way of dealing with any homosexual implications of the ties to mother and best friends and so on is to be sort of precociously phony, aggressive kind of heterosexuality. You know, they're giggling and passing notes and trying to get the boy, you know, to pass another note saying he's interested in her. And of course, the boy, for the time, not want anything to do with girls. So you have this very aggressive heterosexuality is the defense of girls, and a dread of women and boys. And the girls are bigger by 3 inches between 11 and 14. It's a tough time for them. But the hardest thing for the boys, and where I have actually seen the breakdown, and it's really quite serious, is when the incestuous fantasies marked with sadism and ambivalence toward the Oedipal mother actually break through their consciousness in a boy's masturbation. These are highly defended against and terribly threatening to the boy. These incestuous fantasies entertained during masturbation cause pubertal boys to suspend masturbation entirely often. It's very hard to get to in an analytic work with an adolescent. When a boy says, I don't masturbate, even if I'm supervising the case and it's a man treating the boy, I think, I wonder what's burst through. So with this quantitative emergence of all levels of drive impulses, including Oedipal ones in the boy, which the ego has managed very nicely till now, thank you. We have a loud, boisterous, show-off young man, avoiding girls, or showing the most hostile interest, rude and so on, and fearful of the female. Girls precociously are playing at heterosexuality, phallic, tomboyish, well, giggly, and full of secrets and hormones. It is the girls settling into their acceptance that they indeed are made right by their moms. But their moms did make them right as girls. And settling into their own femininity and identifications separate from these longings toward mom. Boys too struggle to settle their own feminine identifications and their envy of the procreative mom. I mean, everybody's coming to the conclusion the girl can grow babies, but she can't be a dad. But the boy, once and for all, has to come to the conclusion he will never grow babies. He can't be a mom, but he can be a dad. So what of this poor ego that I'm not discussing, who's sitting in the corner with its thumb in its ear, who had supremacy by the end of latency? The ego is the synthesizing adaptive function we call brain in standard psychology. It has more functions than adaptation to the outside world. It has to keep peace with drives, needing gratification, as well as the superego, which is quite disapproving of all this sexy, aggressive stuff and the regression. This happens to me at about the 7th hour. All the old defenses are pulled out by the ego. From the old days, reaction formation, displacement, externalization, and especially almost defensive regression. When in doubt, says the ego, stop, step back, and wait. Get reorganized. Peter Blow Sr. cites regression within the ego as a necessary step during the adolescence. He postulates, and this is an important concept that I find intriguing and very true, he postulates that regression in all psychic structures is absolutely necessary for the reorganization that enables the child to proceed the healthy adult. It is the only time in human experience, most theorists would agree, that it is considered not just normal. Because regression isn't normal. I mean, it's normal in the service of the ego. In other ways you can discuss it. It's not usually normal, this massive degree of regression, but it is not only normal, but a prerequisite for adolescent passage. During this pubertal phase, the first main task for either sex is the mastery of infantile longings and fear of the powerful phallic mother. See, in order to get touch with the earlier phases, there has to be a regression in every psychic structure, suggesting that a powerful regression to the pregenital era has happened. It is, in fact, this regression in drive and ego that makes definitive diagnosis of mental illness somewhat uncertain and threw Anna Freud into, this very skeptical, is this health or illness kind of feeling. And you often don't want the people that you're supervising to make a diagnosis of this phase. Everything is kind of up in the air and the ego is trying to cope as it's never been challenged to cope before. The youngster now forcibly turning away from parents, and this is important, in the depletion of one's adaptive capacity or ego, is that he didn't have the parental support anymore. So that which held ego together in the background is having to be avoided and eschewed. Get away from your parents. And without their support, and the ego is also facing being overwhelmed with the surge and drive pressure from every level, physiologically, that we may be quite sympathetic, and the child may be quite symptomatic with everything from various delinquencies to defensive sexual acting out, to startling moodiness as they take on the ambivalence of 2-year-olds again, and a number of nervous habits. And we could talk about that, but it's in Erna Furman mentions ambivalence in her literature. It's fascinating to read. She covers it more generally. The Tyson and Tyson book on psychosexual theories of development is worth having to teach with because it covers every level of psychic development. But they talk about ambivalence of toddlerhood as I do, as being able to love and hate the same person, deal with one's sadism, which is a loving aggression, not pretty. But this contributes to the moodiness of these kids and the irritability. Interviewing a just 16-year-old boy in our project who volunteered for the project on telling about growing up, and there he sat, strong and masculine, through puberty. He thought he could only barely remember how angry and irritable he had been at 13. He recalls his mother telling him that it'll be all right, it's normal, it'll pass. And he would feel somewhat better. The sympathetic mother, a friend of ours, recalled he was so frustrated with himself and with everybody at moments that he would often take his bike 20 miles at a stretch just to blow off steam. He would ride the bike all the way to Dexter and back. Dr. Naha remembers the village. Another concept that is of great interest in terms of the regression in the drive and ego regards the reanimation of the conflicts and traumas of early childhood. Now this is very interesting, and it helps you in helping people who deal with this awkward age. So it is felt that it is possible for the post-latency ego to reorganize and repair much that could not be mastered in early childhood. Did that make sense? I hope that makes sense. The pubertal phase has come to represent a second chance. With the right environmental support for this phase, the personality may proceed forward with a reworking and therefore less distortion from early fixations and traumas. Do you see, when they occurred, the ego was so helpless and so young that it couldn't be mastered, and it got repressed in the first 5 years of life. It gets revived at puberty with a different ego in control, or sort of, or not so in control, but a different ego to help rework those fixations and trauma. A third concept that I find very interesting to entertain is the idea of a second individuation. I first read about the second individuation of Peter Bloch Sr. When he discusses it in his book on adolescence. Just like in the psychic individuation occurring around 3 years of age, adolescents must make a final individuation to become adults. It's a different kind of individuation than a 3-year-old, though. The 3-year-old individuates into a separately functioning preschool. You know, that's when, in the Allen Creek Nursery, they try to separate from their moms and come to school and treat the teacher as a teacher. Not as a parent surrogate, but as a teacher. And they do that by internalizing parental representations. They are able at this point to think, now here's something that's happening. What would my mother say? I mean, they're not consciously doing this because they have some internalizations. Or how would my father handle this? It has now become internal. And they become a standalone child, separate from the former dyad. But that's once he has internalized important aspects of his parents, internalized in all of its meanings, interjects, identifications, etc. The adolescent, however, is attempting to separate from parents by throwing out all of his internalizations and his internal representations of his parents. Ego, superego, etc. He must really do it, in essence. Not completely, obviously, or things go very badly. And then, as the reorganization occurs, he can pick and choose what part of those representations fit him. As he re-internalizes, makes his final identifications, and becomes a unique individual, free of infantile ties, at the end of adolescence, which we can't get to today. So he or she is in puberty, however, is overwhelmed, or at least resisting available parental egos. He has a lot of object, meaning human investment, freed up, which will eventually, in mid-adolescence, be directed outward toward deep friendships and eventually tender sensual ties. In puberty, however, the energy for object ties is thrown back on the self, and it is indeed a narcissistic, self-involved time. Parental idealizations, so necessary in earlier times, as I talked about this morning, is granted indeed to rock stars and leaders of the pack. It is often a discouraging time for parents to bring in their 13-year-old girls asking me, what happened to my Shirley Temple? Another development has to do with cognition and brain development. Hypothetical thinking is in place by 14 or 15. And I thought about this over the years, and I thought, how convenient that cognition follows these phases. I mean, they are as smart as they're going to get by 15 or 16, probably 14, as the brain develops this hypothetical thinking. And they reach full brain power. They seem dumb because they have no life experience. But they are as smart as they're going to get. They can take on calculus. If they had learned all the other stuff before that, which they usually haven't because they don't do well in puberty in school. But their more evolved intelligence seems to occur just as they get a foothold in real genital adolescence, just as it's being reached. And it probably helps the youngster to reorganize the ego structure and put the early drive elements back in their place and proceed on to adolescence. Where narcissistic object choice which is not very attractive in a pubertal child, is replaced by these more mature extra-familial object choices, and reasonable parental representations can be tolerated while not threatening the slowly emerging young adult. When early trauma has not been too grave to rework, and the environment can remain supportive, the youth can proceed to the main work of adolescence proper. Freed from infantile ties in the form of internal early representation, the teenager will take up his ideals, tolerate his disappointment that his parents are hardly ideal and have feet of clay as does he, and proceed to find work and love in a wider community. The noisy reemergence of pregenital impulses will have long since receded, and the ego and drives can go on to other things. The pregenital drives, as I mentioned, can now be relegated to aspects of sexual foreplay, while the drive has become, by late adolescence, focused on genital supremacy and the organization of the impulses. Adults' reaction to their adolescence, it's hard to run a nursery for adults and adolescents. You kind of wish you could, and you end up doing it in your office because you've got, the protagonists and the antagonists on different sides of your office. The adult reactions are very interesting. But a lot gets revived in us grown-ups when we have adolescent children. And a lot that gets revived in having sexy children in the house. Fathers of 13-year-old girls aren't sure they want those kidsies on their laps. And there's a wonderful paper, very fine, E. James Anthony wrote, that's in the Eisman book. It's published several other places. Probably not. Well, I got it back at the hotel. On adult reactions to adolescence with the T. And he talks about the adult reactions and how they get in the way because of what gets stirred up in them. I think I'll stop here because I'm running out of voice. You want to say something about adolescence?
Can I make a comment? I'm a middle school guidance counselor. When I saw this would be on adolescence, I said, oh my gosh, I need to go there. This is my first full year in middle school. I was either high school or early childhood.
Before.
And you have answered all of my questions. These parents constantly are yelling at us. What are we doing to their children? And now I'm going to write all your notes and then I'm going to give you. I have been enlightened, and I just really didn't have enough information on adolescence, but I'm living everything you're saying. It's amazing.
It's like, amazing. They externalize and they can set you and the parents against each other like crazy.
But now I understand why. Thank you so much. It really helps. It's been wonderful.
See, there's these naturals that will teach these kids. They don't know why they can stand and what they do.
Yeah. It's amazing because I was dying to go back to high school. And around December, which was the full year, I said, I'm beginning to like this job. Is there something wrong with me?
No. You have a flexible ego that can tolerate the pulls.
This is my 33rd year in education, and this has been my toughest job.
I know it.
19 years as a teacher, 14 years.
Hang in there. If they all abandon teaching in that period, we won't have well put together.
I say that to them all the time. I'm going to have so much to talk about in the nursing home.
You just help them with their super ego. You tell them to bring you lemonade and.
Well, I know now I have a lot of things to tell parents that I've befriended, and they're going to feel better. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes. One comment, Carol, you probably are aware that recently neuroscience studies of brain development in adolescents have highlighted something that we didn't know at all, and that is that it is a second growth of the frontal lobe. There is a spurt of growth, that means of neurons.
Yeah, literally neurons.
Yeah.
That's right.
Which somehow then a little later, of course, it gives them more controls than they had before.
Right.
We're
That's a
describing that
hypothetical
imbalance where the ego is up in latency, but then the drive comes and there is some
ego
imbalance.
of the brain.
Well, apparently, some of the irrationality that we see in adolescence, which we knew was due to that imbalance, is partly corrected by a growth spurt in the frontal lobe, which is executive organ of behavior. It's the executive lobe of behavior, the one that stops your impulses and makes you more rational and consider reality and things of that kind. Then after a while that has happened, there is a pruning, second pruning, which we didn't know existed either. I have all of that in videotape actually, which we discussed here a little while back. But we're going to give a lecture on all these new developments in brain development. So it seems that much of what we knew as analysts through direct observation and dealing with these children now has some kind of a new basis in the new neurobiological findings of brain development, and this spurt of growth with a later pruning during the same period. But after they exercise essentially what they need, because there is an adaptation to whatever it is that the orientation is there in life, and so there are certain things that will be retained and certain things that become obsolete and will be pruned,
Wow.
And it's really very, very interesting and essentially supports what we have known for many years and what you have described so beautifully.
Yeah, Freud said this will all turn into brain connections. And we know everything can be reduced, in fact, to chemical and electrical impulses between brain cells. There's no question about it. But he cautioned, and we caution, pick whatever conceptual basis you want to study development. We picked this one. You won't find a better one because we've all looked. You can try, but this one's pretty interesting. But make sure that it can include all new findings in brain.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to take you to lunch.